Video game workers need a union. There's no two ways about it. They need a union just like all workers need unions. But when we're talking about tech in the video game industry, we've been seeing so much in the news now about the exploitation, the overwork, the quote-unquote crunch periods, and the layoffs that just so happen to follow these crunch periods. It's a situation that isn't going away. It isn't going away, and the only way it'll be mitigated, if not solved, is through unionization. Simple as that. Workers need to organize themselves into unions where they can bargain collectively on a relatively even foot with their employer. I'm not going to go into all of the details here. Jim Sterling, major YouTuber, has done some fantastic work on various flaws within the kind of quote-unquote AAA gaming industry. But in recent weeks, he's kind of really focused in on workers' rights, talking about how companies that are profitable, sometimes very profitable, still lay off workers, how by use of contracts they keep workers in a state of precarity and uncertainty, which allows for exploitation, how these crunch periods drain people's sanity and their productivity and treat them very poorly, how all of these things are really kind of exploiting basic human dignity of these workers. And even in Canada, and this is where my hook comes in, just yesterday, Eli Glasner from the CBC, is a journalist there, did a really interesting story on how in Canada, the ramifications of crunch, of overwork within the video game industry, of a lack of respect for people's, work-life balance and basic human dignity is playing out. And it's not just, in a kind of statistical sense. He talks to a worker who, in a sense, had a mental and an emotional breakdown because they spent so much time during these crunch periods at work that they just lost all sense of their personal life. There's the story there where, he's sent out to buy diapers for his son, but because he's at home so rarely, he didn't even know what size to buy, and that really sent into him that it's like, look, I'm working so hard that I'm not even being able to enjoy time with my family. It's emblematic of an industry that seems to relish this fact. Relish the fact that people put in 80-hour, 100-hour weeks, that they work for months and months and months on end at 12 and 14-hour days to finish the game during the kind of, again, quote-unquote crunch period, and that this is a sign of dedication. This is, as Jim Sterling would point out, or some companies call it, this is the magic that we do. But it's not magic, of course, it's exploitation. It's exploitation of workers. These people need unions. 100%. And I know that in certain workers in the video game industry, compared to a lot of regular workers, get paid quite well. Who knows, when you actually look at their salary divided by the number of hours, I'd love to know, because I know these workers aren't getting adequately compensated for their overtime. But I know they take home decent wages. But wages aren't everything. Basic workplace health and safety is important. And overwork may not draw headlines as much as, people being killed or dismembered on the job. But systematic overwork for this amount of time at this level is a health and safety issue. And unions are there to bargain to improve those things. Legislation in many cases isn't enough. And even if the legislation is good, it often goes unenforced. And this goes on top of the fact that while often people, when we think of AAA game industry workers, sometimes we think of like the highly compensated programmers and designers and what have you. But it's not just them. It's people who do work within quality assurance and testing and what have you, who are often lower compensated. Their work is even more precarious. And so, whereas you might be able to hypothetically say, although I disagree, that, look, you want to take home a six-figure salary, you're going to have to put in 60-hour weeks at times. What are we saying to the people who work precariously for, much less than that? Not only are they not getting the six-figure salary, they're not getting the work-life balance. So this is where we're at. Video game workers need a union. And there's Game Workers Unite, There's other forms of organizations that are starting to really gain momentum. Because here's the deal. A lot of video game workers, especially those with some sort of STEM background, like those within the computer science background, there's been a long-standing kind of belief that those workers didn't need unions. That their skills, being so technically proficient, being so cutting edge, gave them all the protection they needed. And that all they needed to do was just leave the company and go get a better job if their job ever started, paying insufficiently or treating them poorly. But as we've seen within tech is oligopolistic. And there's been cases in the United States, at least, where tech companies have been caught, effectively colluding with one another to keep wages and compensation down, even for highly skilled workers. So when big video game companies and big tech companies are kind of ganging up on the workforce, the potential work pool of workers, be they low-skilled, quote-unquote, or be they, tech workers that are seen as high-skilled, the reality is that those people aren't being fairly compensated as if, there was actually competition. And there's never going to be competition. The idea of free markets is largely a lie perpetuated to kind of keep people from actually seeing the mechanisms of modern capitalism, which is that people try to make as much money as they can and pay as little as they can to their workers while doing so. Simple reality. So the only response a worker has in that case, the only effective one, is to go beyond themselves and find the collective solution, which is a union. That's the path forward here. Video game workers are treated extremely poorly. They don't have a lot of the basic rights that they should have. And it doesn't matter that their salaries are good. That's not enough to throw away concerns about mental health. And when you're working that long, frankly, it's also a physical health concern. Mental and physical health. There's no excuse. So this is a great opportunity for workers within tech more broadly to realize that their skills will not protect them. And again, it's only going to get worse. Tech skills in programming, and a lot of these sorts of mathematics-based skills are way easier to outsource than my kind of work as a historian. The historical context is different in every country. The systems are different. Tech is way easier to outsource. The only solution is for workers, not just in Canada and the United States and other, developed nations, but eventually worldwide, to organize those tech jobs. It's the only solution. And this is also an opportunity, frankly, for the labor movement, the non-tech unions, because the reality is that the labor movement has gone through ebbs and flows of its success in organizing workers. I've made videos and I've written articles about this in the past where, there was a time where unions only represented, specific narrow trades of people. You'd have a union for cigar makers, a union for a specific kind of baker, about 16 or more railway unions, each representing small sections of the railway workers. And often these unions were isolated, and often these unions failed to actually represent a majority of the broad working man, even factory workers, jobs we often associate with unions. And then eventually you saw the rise of unions in places like auto factories and steel factories and mines, where workers were organized on a factory basis. Even if they were skilled or unskilled, they were in the same union, and workers bargained together to achieve the best conditions and wages and treatment that they could. And unions would eventually expand into other fields like, public sector unions after the post-war period, especially as unions at the provincial and federal level won collective bargaining rights. But one sector, really two sectors, that unions have really struggled to organize in is one, the service sector, whether it's fast food or retail or what have you. And another one is white-collar professionals, be they in finance or be they in tech. Again, these workers often have an adverse relationship to unions because they feel that, one, unions are something for, blue-collar folks, or there's something for public sector workers, or there's something for those who can't take care of themselves, or that they prevent, the successful from rising above the mediocre, But none of those things are true. All workers need unions. And workers in those sectors need unions because they're being exploited. 100%. And again, it's not always through wages with these workers. It may not be a strict wage issue. It might be a more hours of work issue. It might be your ability to separate your family and work life issue. It might be based on, workplace harassment, or it might be based on things like, you're quote unquote volunteering to work longer hours, but we all know that volunteer gig is nothing less than mandatory if you want to keep your job or if you want to keep moving up. In which case, it's not volunteer at all. It's not volunteer at all. Effectively, it's mandatory. All of these things affect a lot of white-collar private sector positions. And those workers need to realize that while historically they might have looked down on a lot of, union-sectored workers, the time has come where they need those unions. They need them. And so here's to a realization that while there are certainly differences in compensations between, minimum wage workers at a fast food place and maybe highly paid tech workers in the video game industry, or workers that work at on Bay Street that get paid well, at the end of the day, if you make the majority of your income as a worker and you don't have management responsibilities at your job, you are a working class person and you need a union to defend your working class interests. And again, there are ways here that unions can be made to work within the tech sector. Again, some people have noted saying that, well, we don't need a union or we don't want a union in tech because a union will set one standard wage for every worker, regardless of their skill sets or what have you, and we don't want that because we want to reward workers that find creative solutions and what have you. And again, the strict wage scales work in a lot of jobs. But if you look to many unions, and I've been in one, a faculty association, the reality is that while the union does set certain uniform standards, wage levels aren't one of them. They set certain wage floors, for instance. They set for parameters for how you determine how wage increases and how bonuses and how other forms of compensation and awards are handed out. But they're not handed out on an equal basis even within union environments. And there's no reason why within tech or within other white-collar professions where perhaps the jobs are more based in kind of individual work within a collective project, that you can't have a union that sets the parameters to protect you but allows for individual variances of compensation, at least to a degree. So let's hope for a productive marriage, and let's hope that we can kind of stick it to these companies that, talk about crunch and talk about magic when really it's just the age-old, centuries-old, story of capital exploiting labor, and we should have no more time for it.